everyone. And good afternoon to our colleagues joining from Ontario and Atlanta, Canada, actually. But before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining from Vancouver on the traditional ancestral and unceded territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I would like to express my gratitude for opportunity to live and work on this land. My name is Brian. I'm joining from Vancouver General Hospital. I'm the member of the CMBES IDEA committee. It is very nice to see you all today. And I have the honor to moderate the session today. Um, the IDEA committee is dedicated to fostering more of inclusive, equitable, and accessible environment within clinical and biomedical engineering. So as part of this effort, we have organized a series of 3 webinars this March, highlighting outstanding women leaders and innovators in Canadian STEM industry. So we'll kick off the series. It is my pleasure to introduce Rashmi Prakash. Rashmi is an internationally recognized biomedical engineer, educator, entrepreneur working at the intersection of the human and environmental health. She's also founder and CEO of Aruna Revolution, a fiber technology company developing a compostable absorbent materials for sustainable hygiene products. For today's talk, Rashmi will reframe the inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility as engineering design requirements rather than the social add-on. So that shows how health technologies and systems often fail when entire populations are overlooked. For during the session, please leave your questions in the chat box and we'll bring them up at the end of the session in our Q&A time. So without further ado, I'll pass the stage to Rashmi. Take it away.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, and thank you for everyone for joining today. This is a really important conversation, so thank you for being a part of it. I'm going to be doing a 30-minute presentation followed by Q&A, so feel free to type your questions into the chat or unmute as you'd like, and happy to make this into a discussion too. So without further ado, let me share my screen. This is a topic that I'm very, very passionate about. And, one thing that I've realized is that if you're not intentionally designing systems that work for everyone, you're intentionally excluding people. And I think that's a really important concept to understand. And so I think today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the statistics around how the current healthcare system is and some of the things that we can do to make it better, more equitable. So my background is I did both my undergraduate degree and my master's degree in biomedical engineering at the University of British Columbia. Before starting my own biomedical engineering company, I've worked at various other companies. So I've worked at a not-for-profit developing assistive technologies for people with disabilities. I've worked at a for-profit developing medical devices that have been used in over 10 million surgeries annually. I've worked at a startup where we created surgical robots. I've worked at the healthcare authorities where I learned a lot about how medical devices are used. So it's been a really interesting journey, and now I have the privilege of having my own company in the healthcare space, but also I'm a professor at the University of British Columbia in the biomedical space too. And I also am the chair of an ISO mirror committee where we're developing standards to standardize menstrual products too. I've I've had the privilege of speaking on several different stages from the World Economic Forum to various other stages around the world where I've been recognized by the government for my innovation. So it's really, really great to see that other people are recognizing the value of equity and sustainability too. So yeah, it's great. Now that I'm done bragging about myself and why I'm qualified to talk to you today, let's actually talk about the problem. So health technology truly does have a design problem. Right now, we've realized that 94% of medical device trials have historically excluded women or underrepresented groups. And I've been sure to include all of my citations here, so I'll be happy to pass this along for you to go and review some of these articles as well. I think they're very interesting. There's quite a high misdiagnosis rate as a result of this. So, for example, one of the statistics that I'm always quite surprised by is that women are 50% more likely to be misdiagnosed after a heart attack. And what's funny is sometimes we don't even recognize a heart attack ourselves because we experience high levels of pain during our menstrual cycles. And so to us, it doesn't feel as bad as it actually is sometimes. So there's a lot of challenges associated with that too. There's also algorithmic biases. So For example, we're seeing a lot more deployment of AI tools and AI diagnostic tools, but the issue is that these tools have been trained on a very narrow data set, and as a result of this, the output that you see fails across skin tones, genders, body types, various aspects of the demographics that haven't been included as part of the data set. And the result of this, the cost of this, is that sometimes the populations that are in need the most are often the last to benefit from the healthcare innovation. So, the populations that might be experiencing more of a specific type of illness might be the last to get treated for it as a result of not being included in the trials to develop the medical device. So this truly is a really big problem, and this happens for various reasons. To be honest, there's more reasons than I've accounted for here, and I would highly encourage you to go and look into it and even try to think about reasons yourself. But one of the big reasons from my perspective is the homogenous teams. So if I'm imagining most people here are engineers. So if you're an engineer, you've probably had the experience of walking down the hallway in your university where they've got the class pictures of all of the classes from, your degree before. So from the 1960s, 1970s. And as you're looking at those pictures, you notice something. Typically, it's mostly white males that are in these pictures. And the thing is that's great that they've been able to go through and do their degrees, but their perspective is that they're able to relate to in life. And so as a result, when you're seeing these people go through their degree, they go and then create devices, they lack the perspective of the rest of the demographic. And so as a result, what we're seeing right now is medical devices failing. And so when engineering teams lack the diversity, there are huge blind spots that go unnoticed, that things that you wouldn't have been able to think of yourself because it's culturally contextual or it's things that you haven't experienced in life. And so designers can really only see and work on what they know. And that's why I think it's really, really important to have to focus on diversity when it comes to the teams that you're building too. Um, and, one of the things that we do when we're creating devices is we typically tend to do a lot of internal testing and validation before we go and test on external populations. And if your internal team is homogenous, then again, you're testing on a homogenous population. But then also, if you are going and creating tests where you're not including a diverse population as part of your tests, then again, it's going to be missing a lot of different aspects. So when clinical trials and user testings default to, a very narrow demographic, which has historically been white, young, able-bodied men, then it becomes a challenge because that doesn't always apply. Now, some examples of this that aren't immediately related to race or gender, but are easier to understand is when I was doing segmentation, we were creating a machine learning AI algorithm at one of the companies that I was working at. And this algorithm was basically used to segment segment and label the vertebrae. Now, if you don't have the test cases where you've got your extra thoracic bone or your extra lumbar bone, then it's never going to catch that. But the problem is that those exist in real life. And so when, people are undergoing surgery and they have that, there's a very high chance something could happen. Now, this is an example that's very easy to understand because it's related to a very specific part of the body. But imagine this on a larger scale where, the implications from different demographics. We know that biology does vary depending on where you're from. And so if you don't include the various biologies, whether that's different skin colors, different, abilities, then it does become quite challenging to make sure that the device works for everyone. I think the other problem is this perception around equity, and we're seeing that especially right now as it gets challenged throughout various countries. Do we need EDI? We're seeing a lot of these large corporations take a step back in their policies for it. And quite often it's seen as like a nice to have, a political alignment. But from a biomedical engineering perspective, I think it can be quite dangerous to have that perspective. It's not a social goal that we're trying to meet. It's just an engineering requirement. So when you deprioritize equity because of time constraints or budget constraints, you're actively deciding that this medical device may or may not work for specific populations. And I think that's very dangerous. And, as engineers, we've taken an oath to make sure that we put everyone's health in front, as the priority. So I think as engineers and biomedical engineers, equity isn't a nice to have. It really is a requirement. So this is a case study, and this is the pulse oximeter. And we saw this come to light during COVID, but actually this was something that I had worked on and discovered previously too. So I'll get to that in a second. But during COVID, we saw that pulse oximeters, which I'm sure you know, but they measure blood oxygen saturation and sometimes heart rate too, or pulse rate rather, were cleared for clinical use based on trials that didn't represent darker colored skin. And so there were studies that were published where it showed that these devices overestimated oxygen saturation in blood of Black people and Hispanic people and various other people that had darker skin color, which led to delayed treatments and worse outcomes for them. So if you know anything about pulse oximeters, you know that they've been around for a very, very long time. So what these studies showed us was that there was a three or three times higher rate of undetected low oxygen in Black patients. Um, we also saw the FDA put out safety communication around this device as well in 2021 during the pandemic. But this device has been used in clinical settings for well over 20 years. And so this has been ongoing for a very, very long time. So I was working at a company called Delphi Medical, and one of the sensors that they use is a pulse oximeter. We were looking at blood oxygen saturation and heart rate as a means to check for limb occlusion pressure. And so when I was working on it, obviously I'm the one developing it, testing it. I'm testing it on myself first. And when I was testing it, I was like, why is this device not working for me? When I test it on my boss, when I test it on some of my colleagues, it works fine. So when I put it on my skin, it's not working. And so I kind of went crazy a little bit when I was first doing it. And I was like, oh, maybe it's, I haven't put it on properly. Maybe my fingers are too big or too small. Maybe I have nail polish on. I checked everything. And there were certain things that were also causing issues. So for example, the use of incandescent lights versus LED was causing issues with the lights as well. So there are other things too. But it was noted that they had never really done any significant amount of testing on skin colors. And so as a result, I was one of the ones that led that initiative and I tested it on myself and other colleagues that had darker skin. And so I think it's really important to use your voice well when you're in these situations. If you're from a population that isn't historically represented, then it is your responsibility to be able to go in and solve this issue and make sure that you do become represented. Um, I think it is a big responsibility that you advocate, and it is something that will make a change because it was a change that was then accepted and now has been fixed in the device. It's something that I'm confident isn't an issue in those devices anymore. Um, so when you do notice it, it is really important to make that change. And there's something called the diversity quality principle where it basically means that the more people from different backgrounds who are involved in building the technology, the better that technology becomes for everyone, the more it's usable by everyone. And so, as you start having more and more people that are from a diverse demographic that are participating in the development of these medical devices, you're going to see that they start working better for more people because you're having diverse teams that are able to identify those failure modes, those edge cases, which are just, things that haven't been considered because the people haven't been involved as part of the development and understanding of them. And what it also allows, because the other thing is, and having worked from a startup perspective, I realized that it's quite challenging to get a good trade-off between economic viability and making sure it fits for absolutely every single person and it's accessible for every single person. But I think the thing is once you realize that this device, by having more people and by thinking about equity and having more diverse people as part of the team that's building it, you're able to get a wider market fit. If you're able to create a device that works well for everyone in Canada, amazing. But then if you're able to get a device that works well for everyone in Canada, but then you can also import it to, let's say, countries in Africa, countries in Asia, then you get a wider market fit. And the thing is that equity and scale actually work well together. If you consider equity, it lets you scale to the global population much more effectively too. And as you think about growing into these different economies, obviously regulatory compliance is going to be really important. And globally, we're seeing the bar for that increase, especially when it comes to inclusive design. So having that diversity component right from the beginning will actually allow you to grow faster rather than retrofitting it later on. It's kind of that cost over time principle where, you've created a device, it's in the market, it's so much more expensive to actually change it at that point versus thinking about this right from the beginning and making sure you're designing for it. So ultimately, there's a lot of economic benefits to thinking about equity as a design requirement too. So these are some other examples. There was an early AI skin cancer tool that was primarily trained on light skin data sets. As a result, the accuracy for dark skin was dramatically lower. So what changed as a result of this was Stanford's diverse training initiative, actually improved demographic accuracy by 34%. So by including training initiatives, they're able to improve the accuracy of a medical device. Um, I'm sure you've heard of these cases, but there were several cardiac devices, so like implantable defibrillators, pacemakers, that were developed based on male anatomy, which led to complications in women. And one of the most well-known is how these medical devices, they were created with a specific heart rate in mind and implanted into people, but an example that was never considered was pregnant women. Women get pregnant, right? So if you put it into a pregnant woman, if you know anything about pregnancy, you know that the heart rate changes when you get pregnant. And so if you've got an implanted pacemaker and your heart rate changes, it was shocking the pregnant women. People hadn't planned for it or thought about it. And that led to some really serious results. But this is starting to change, and we're starting to see more and more female-focused device trials, which are leading to new factors being considered that actually benefit all kinds of small frame patients too. We're also seeing mental health apps come into play, cognitive behavioral therapy-based apps, but also several AI-based apps too. And what's interesting is that these apps are designed around a Western individualist framework. And so the issue with this is that not everyone thinks this way. And so when someone that is not from a Western culture tries to use these apps, it doesn't work for them. And it's very similar to how, when you're going to get medical services, there's higher clinical, like a better clinical outcome if you go to someone that is from your own background, whether, it's Black women going and getting maternal treatment from a Black caregiver, for example. Or someone from, an Asian country going to an Asian therapist because they're able to understand the cultural context associated with it. And so with a lot of these apps, what changed was when you started seeing the culturally adapted versions, you started to see significantly higher engagement and outcomes and uses from South Asian and East Asian populations. And so by including diversity as part of your requirement, again, it does really allow for not only improved accuracy and better clinical outcomes, but also more engagement for economical benefits too. Intersectionality as an engineering lens. I think this is quite interesting because, and we know this and we think about this, but I don't think it's quite often put this way. But no one is just one thing, and neither is the population that you're designing for. So, as an equity-centered engineer, we need to ask, who is harmed when we get this wrong? Who is missing from the room around us as we're building this? These are engineering questions, and I know so often they get thought of as political questions, but it is really, really important for us to ask these questions. So thinking about things from, our is there a good representation of gender in this room? Is there a good representation of race and ethnicity in this group for this medical device and the demographic that we're trying to help? Is there a good representation of disability status, of age? And I'm sure that there's various other parameters to think about as well, but these are just some that we can think of right now. There's this really great saying, and it comes from various different indigenous cultures here in Canada, but how it goes is there's nothing about us without us. And so as we're developing things, we need to make sure that there's nothing that no decisions were made about us without us. And so it's something that we should take into engineering framework as well, I believe. It will help us improve equitability significantly. So one of the things is mapping your gap. So before you design, audit who is and isn't represented in your team. And be honest about it. Like, think about who you've got in your team, your advisors, and your test population, and the data sets. And thinking about that intentionally, I think, is going to be very important. Um, as you're doing that, also make sure to bridge those gaps by including those communities in the design. So bringing in people that are affected from the earliest stages and co-designing with them is a very, very great way to go about doing this effectively. So, for example, if you're creating something and you want to help a specific population, let's say the indigenous population, have them involved as part of the design. And test across populations. So make sure that you're looking for skin tone, gender, body size, age, language, geography. Again, I'm just naming a handful of parameters, but there's so many more. And quite a lot of them are contextual to the specific medical device too. And as we go through things, we often set these key performance indicators. It needs to make sure we meet these standards. So let's say the 60601 standards, for example. So it meets the current threshold, safety threshold, all of this. We often set KPIs for economics. So we need to make sure we're generating this amount of profitability. We're making sure that we're growing this much. We're getting this market. We should be doing that for equity too, making sure that we're covering this percent of population, we're doing this and we're doing that. Because if you make it a part of your systems in as many places as possible, then it becomes a really key factor that will allow for improved clinical outcomes and success. So, with my company, there's a lot of different ways. I think it's always great to look at this from an example of how someone is doing it. So, this is some of the ways that I tried to do it myself. So, with Aruna, what we've done is we've developed compostable menstrual product. And this compostable menstrual product, we extract fibers from cellulose from agricultural residuals. And so there's several different reasons that we do this because I believe that a lot of the materials that are on the market are not sustainable. They're not sourced equitably. There's a lot of issues with labor ethics in addition to safety and functionality when it comes to the engineering side of things as well. And so we developed our own process for extracting fibers, and we decided to get these materials from local farmers. By working with local farmers, we're empowering the local economy, but also we're reducing the emissions associated with transportation. We're providing funding into our economy. We're working with farmers that are some of the hardest workers in our country. So that's one of the ways that we think about it. So supply chain aspects to equity. Think about where all your materials come from and see how you can improve the equity associated with that. Making sure that where you're getting it from, the people that are the laborers and working on it are also equitably taken care of. Access by design. So we're building these products and working really hard to make them affordable and available in low resource contexts too. So we're not adapting them after the fact, but it's something that is part of the design and something that we've been thinking of intentionally for how to do that. We're creating material innovation for all types of skin. So one thing that we're thinking of is, as we're using this, a lot of our own team have various skin-related challenges. So how can we make sure that it works for all skins, all body types? We're also being quite inclusive with the gender too. So, for example, you'll see that everywhere we refer to it as menstruators, people who menstruate, so that we can make sure that everyone that experiences menstruation has access to menstrual products. And this is something where, the people that are menstruating, and in our case, we are women, are the ones that are building this product for ourselves too. So we see this representation in leadership, in our advisory, in our supply chain. We're making sure that everyone that is being a part of this are people that tend to use the products and understand the products themselves and understand what life without the products would be like as well. So these are some of the things that we think of and we are attempting to do. Again, it's very difficult to achieve perfection when it comes to this, but the point is to try. So some of the things that you as a biomedical engineer can do today, um, audit your test population. So does it reflect the people who are actually going to be using this device in the system? That's a question you can ask yourself about the population. And you can also do that by looking at the room and seeing who is part of the room that may or may not be included that is in your test population. Um, Read failure literature. There's actually a huge amount of literature out there that provides you with examples of how technology has harmed underrepresented groups. And by understanding the design gaps, you can then make sure that you don't make the same mistakes. I think that as a culture, like we really tried to look at all the good things that we're doing, but I think it is really important to look at where we've mistakes and learn from those mistakes so that we don't make the mistakes ourselves. Adding equity criteria to your design requirements before even the development begins. So make sure that it's part of the development and the planning. Bringing in community voices early. So anyone that could be interacting with the group, whether that's patient advocacy groups, community healthcare workers, or even the healthcare providers that will be part of this, end users, making sure that they're all co-designers and are involved with the development of it. Advocating for diverse hiring on your team. This is really important and would highly recommend that this is something that you consider. Not again, not as a social goal, but as truly a quality requirement. And then challenge your assumptions out loud. I know that I make mistakes a lot, and I'm so grateful when people like have a discussion with me and talk to me about it. I think it's really important to be able to create psychological safety for equity related discussions in your team and in the peer group that you're in. So I would highly recommend creating a space where you can challenge those assumptions out loud. Okay, so as I wrap things up, I think it's really important that we recognize that this is really the standard that we hold ourselves to, and I think it's really important to hold ourselves to high standards. So, and if, a device, an algorithm, a system that you're building, if it fails for a whole population, then that really is a design failure, and it's our responsibility as engineers to prevent it. And I think this is really, really why equity is truly like not an add-on or a social benefit. It is just engineering excellence. And I really do pride myself in my engineering and my innovation. And I want to make sure that it really does help the health of as many people in the world as possible. And I hope you do too. So thank you for your time. Happy to move over to questions and have a conversation.
Yeah. Thank you, Rashmi. That was a very insightful presentation, and some of the examples you have shared really highlight like how critical inclusive design is in healthcare and engineering. And it's always shocking that there are a lot of population that gets missed out in this design process. All right, that will take us to the Q&A session. I do have a question in the chat box from Shirley. The question is, when we talk about equitable access to healthcare, including medical devices, one of the challenges is how to get the devices to remote communities or communities with fewer resources that may also lack access to skilled workforce to use or service them. So in your opinion, what are the practical ways to expand this access to remote or under-resourced communities through design of the medical devices and health management systems? And the second question is, how do we ensure that the designing simple to transport and use doesn't mean a loss in functionalities or quality of the product, yet meeting economical requirements for more expensive devices such as imaging equipment or surgical equipment?
That's a great question. That's a great question. So I think step one is to recognize that there are remote communities where using medical devices that we would typically design are difficult. One of the examples that I talk about in the course that I teach at UBC is also Wi-Fi. So people are so quick to create an app that uses Wi-Fi, that needs Bluetooth, whatever, but a lot of people, especially the people that need access to healthcare, which are typically the aging population or people in rural communities, don't have access to stable Wi-Fi. They don't have access to like the latest cell phone. And so if your phone needs an update, they won't be able to use it. And I think it is a very challenging design problem to have to think about remote communities, but I think it's just as difficult of a design problem as how, when women aren't included because of their hormonal cycles. It's something that we do have to think about and we do have to address. In my opinion, the best way to do that is to try and understand what life in a remote community is like. I think that might challenge us a little bit in the sense of like, what do they have access to? What do they not have access to? Because I think the biggest part about the challenge is just a lack of understanding. Once you have that understanding, then you're likely able to create a device that is quite efficient and will work in those communities. And, sometimes it's if there's people or if there's a lack of trained staff to be able to use those devices in those communities, then it might just be something where you create a device that is really simple to use and doesn't require high levels of training. Or if it's a device that, needs access to electricity and there isn't continuous access to electricity, maybe you figure out a way to add in extra batteries and power banks to be able to power it while, the electricity is unstable at specific times. So there are ways. You just have to think about it and you have to care about it enough and make sure you understand. Step one to solving any kind of problem, as we know, is to understand and make sure we are solving the actual problem instead of the problem we assume it to be.
Thank you. Yeah, we have a second question from Carol.
Mhm.
What guidance do you share with hospital-based biomedical and clinical engineers relative to recommending medical devices to their health systems? So, especially interested in your thoughts about reviewing published clinical studies or trials.
I think that's a great question. And I think this is a really, really important question because after having worked in the healthcare system a bit and seeing how these devices are often explored in order to be recommended and how they're studied, I think that a lot more could be done, especially from the perspective of equity too. And so, I think it's perhaps creating some kind of SOP and reviewing and regularly updating it where you do have the requirement to look into specific things. So, for example, when they created this medical device and when they tested it for clinical outcomes, did they look for, did who was their test patients? Who are they making sure that this device worked on? So, being very critical about things like that, I think, is something that you absolutely should be doing. And quite often you're able to connect directly with the manufacturer to get this information, seeing how open they are about this, I think tells you a lot about the device that they've created too. So yeah, I think when you're reviewing published clinical trials studies, make sure you have that equity lens on for sure, in addition to performance lens on, so that you can compare performance to equitable outcomes and accuracy. But don't be afraid to reach out and connect with the manufacturer themselves.
That's a good point. Rashmi, I have a question for you
Mm.
with your entrepreneurs' perspectives. So
Mm.
expanding those data sets and test population can also increase development cost and,
Mm.
product release timelines.
Mm.
And, at the same time, a lot of manufacturers or innovators or entrepreneurs want to be the first in the market to gain that market share or establish themselves as the technology leaders. So how can organization or entrepreneurs or innovators realistically balance those pressures between, speed versus, representing inclusivity in their design?
This is a great question. I think this is a really, really important question. I think that regardless of what you want, you never sacrifice a clinical outcome for speed and time and money. As biomedical engineers, everything we should be doing is to make sure that people are healthy and our device works well. But from an entrepreneur perspective, I know that time is money and money is also money, and you don't have a lot of it, especially when you're working at a startup. And I think that there is quite a unique opportunity in somehow creating a platform where people are able to share their health data through them, like with their own intention. And so people having sovereignty to their own data and being able to share that so that people can use it towards medical studies, I think is very, very great. Like it's a very big opportunity. And I think that there is an opportunity for innovation there. But yeah, I think, I mean, the other thing is I think that it seems more difficult and more challenging than it is sometimes. Sometimes, especially if you plan it ahead of time, it becomes a lot more cost effective. So if you're like, okay, I want representation from all of these populations, let's look for them, scout them out, bring them in, as opposed to doing it and being like, oh, okay, we've done this test, but we realize we don't have this population. What are we going to do now? It's more expensive to cost correct rather than to make sure that you've.
Maybe we lose Rashmi. Sorry, I think we lost you at the
Oh,
last bit
did,
of the answer.
oh
Yeah.
no. What part
Yeah.
did you lose me at?
Uh, you mentioned that including the inclusivity as a requirement, it becomes cost effective
Mm.
naturally. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So yeah, so if you just have it as part of your planning, it becomes easier to do it
Mhm.
compared to going back and fixing it later. But again, there's opportunity for innovation when in this space to allow that to happen, even if you have made a mistake.
That's right. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. I have a question from Mario. Is there a particular type of questions we should ask when developing an RFP for medical devices to address how companies design with equity included in their design process?
I think so. I mean, I don't have a list of questions off the top of my head, but what I would say is kind of think back to uh, the design process. So, for example, have a look at their team, have a look at how they've thought about it, ask them about their test populations, ask them about clinical outcomes. Don't be afraid to like audit their data and be like, okay, like show me what this looked like for, this population in this age range or this population with disability, this population that's from this race. Like, I think everyone should be able to audit these businesses and make sure that they're doing things properly.
All right. I'll take two more questions.
Sure.
There's one question in the chat. There are plenty of business case studies where engineers were shut down or were afraid to speak up when something was not right. So, how would you coach the engineers, younger or older engineers, to have the courage to speak up and keep speaking up?
This is a great question. And I'm sure if Alice had her video on, she'd be laughing at this too, because this is something that we've both experienced. Um, it's difficult. The politics and the bureaucracy when it comes to working under someone else is quite challenging. And so it does become quite difficult to speak up, but it is important. And there are regulations in place. So there are regulatory bodies even for engineers. So for example, in BC, it's Engineers BC, and you have similar regulatory bodies throughout Canada. There is a national one, Engineers Canada too. So what I would say is like the moment you start noticing something, try to talk to the people around you. And if you're struggling to um move in the right direction, then be afraid to go out and consult to these regulatory bodies. And I mean, CMBES is one of them too. So you can reach out to the community here, reach out to people and ask them, hey, this is happening right now. How should I be reacting to this? What should I do? I don't think that this is right. Um, because there are things that happen where, you have managers that tell you not to report things because they want to maintain a good relationship with someone for something else and so on and so forth. And it does become quite challenging. So how I would recommend you do it is try to use the regulatory bodies in your favor because at the end of the day, they are there to take care of these things and support you with these things because it's difficult. And I don't say this to discourage people from doing this, but it is difficult to try to tackle some of these yourself, especially when you're younger and you don't have as much influence in the space.
Right. Yeah, it's always challenging. Um, maybe I'll finish it up with one last question. So looking ahead, what do you think will be the biggest drivers pushing the medical technologies industries towards more inclusive design? Would it be like regulatories, market demand, or changes
I
in our engineering culture?
Totally. I would hope it's changes in our engineering culture. But I feel like money speaks the loudest sometimes. And we're seeing markets change completely where economic powers that used to be predominant before are now, where we're seeing a shift in that and shift in different countries and different demographics having more economic power. And as a result, I think that that will drive market demand certainly. So for example, if previously, let's say we used to make most of our sales in the US, but now we're seeing a greater market pull from India. Obviously, we're going to develop and make sure that we're thinking about different countries and different demographics and that the device works for different people. So I do think that there is a lot of pull from that perspective too, but I would really hope that the engineering culture is changing. And from my perspective, having been both in the industry as well as now teaching as a professor too, I do see that changing. I'm seeing, the populations that are coming through engineers change quite differently than the pictures we used to see on the wall 20, 30, 40 years ago. So I think as a result of that, we're automatically going to have a lot of changes and perspectives going into creating these devices. But yeah, I think it'll be a combination of the both.
Well, thank you so much, Rashmi. That was a very insightful. It was very meaningful session for all of us joining. And for those joining, thank you so much for joining us for the kickoff webinar in our Women in STEM series held by CMBS and the IDEA Committee in the celebration of the International Women's Day. So we hope Rashmi's talk offered meaningful insight to everyone on how to build more inclusive, equitable, and human-centered health systems.
Thank you so much for having
Before,
me.
yeah, and everyone, before we let you go, we are excited to continue the series on March 19th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, 9 a.m. Pacific Time, with our next webinar featuring Ferna Rodriguez. Ferna is an executive director of the Master in Translational Medicine program at UC Berkeley, leading when it's hard, engineering courage in a high-stakes system, building authority, resilience, and inclusive systems under pressure. So this following session will explore how technical professionals can lead with clarity and courage in complex, high-stakes environment, kind of similar to the question that we received earlier. So yeah, we look forward to seeing you there. And thank you so much for your time. And thank you again, Rashmi.
Thank you. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Yeah,
Bye.
thank you. Bye-bye.